Hello Penguinauts, I'm the Beardy Penguin and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program for All Kerbalkind, kicking off 1960 with yet another launch of our Cosmos launch vehicle. Now I did express an interest in turning this launch vehicle into a kind of universal rocket for our space program with a different variant for each of our differently sized launch pads, but I constructed a 60-ton A variant to replace our R8 rocket and it ended up being more expensive and less capable, so I decided to scrap that, and this is now the A variant of the launch vehicle, the 110-ton variant. Although there is a B variant, which you will see in the next episode, with an upgraded second stage, which can just lift a little bit more payload into orbit, which we need to launch Tundra orbit satellites, which are very similar to Molniya orbits, except they have a 24-hour period instead of a 12-hour period, but they're still very highly eccentric and they're very good for communications at high latitudes. But that's not what we are launching now. Now, this is Svet 5, and this is a kind of a multi-purpose satellite. We're just launching this to complete two contracts. So the first contract is just to essentially put something into orbit with some payload on it, and we get a bit of money for that. But since we actually unlocked the infrared radiometer and the orbital perturbation experiment in the previous episode, we're going to use this to try and get a bit of science. The infrared radiometer has biome-specific low and high space science, so we're going to leave this in orbit for as long as possible until it's almost run out of power, because those solar panels do degrade alarmingly fast at our current tech level and with the alarming frequency of solar storms at the moment. So then once it's almost out of power, we're going to push it into its final orbit and complete the second contract. And the reason why we're waiting to do that is because the second contract actually hands off the satellite to the customer. We lose control of the satellite and it's handed off, I believe, as a communications test satellite. So what we're going to do is hand that off to the customer and push it into its final orbit a little bit later on in the episode, and a little bit later on in the year. You can see here we're just firing our final stage and we're pushing it like right up close to that orbit, but not quite actually achieving the orbital parameters stated in the contract. So a little bit cheeky. We're giving them an almost dead satellite, but you know, whatever. They should have specified in the small print of the contract that we had to actually give them a working satellite. And you can see that we're actually powered by a new engine. Well, it's the same engine, but a new variant of the engine. You can see this is a much bigger satellite than we've previously been able to launch, because we're now using the RDA-1 300 variant of that ORM-65 engine. So after completing that mission, our VAB upgrade completes, and that actually gives us access to a second production line here at Baikonur. So using some of the upgrade points we got from our science, we're going to begin pouring points into that second upgrade line. And around the same time, we also finish our research on interplanetary communications, and that gives us access to a whole host of new antennas as well as a tracking station upgrade. And that means we can start planning interplanetary missions, but that will be a little bit later on. First, we're making our third attempt to launch a long-term spy satellite. And yes, it's a spy satellite. Everyone knows it's a spy satellite or whatever. The CIA probably know it's a spy satellite at this rate. We're going to make our third attempt to launch this from Plesetsk. Now, the rocket engines on the R8, we've fired them so many times now, the failure rate is less than 1%. So I was like, if this fails, I'm actually just gonna destroy the whole Plesetsk launch site. Okay, there's got to be something wrong with the personnel, right? Just clear house, send them all to Siberia and completely replace them with some of the staff from Baikonur. But no, thankfully this launch goes off without a hitch, and you'll see we have access to some new interstage hollow fairings, which are far more realistic as we hot stage our engines and those exhaust plumes need somewhere to go. Because we're now actually in 1.10.1. We were in 1.8.1. We've upgraded our install, and that gives us access to Waterfall as well, which is providing those absolutely gorgeous engine plumes and a few other bits and bobs, as well as that new variant for the RDA. Well, I guess it's the ORM-65, and now we have access to the RDA-1 300 variant of it, which doubles the thrust and has a second ignition. So that's what's allowing us to launch larger satellites into their final orbits. But you can see here we just about managed to get Pogoda 6 into its final orbit, and finally we can begin our long-term surveillance of the United States and see what the Astral Foundation has been constructing. However, in the previous year, the Astral Foundation did actually manage to leapfrog us. They finally put an orbiter in orbit of the moon. It actually arrived in orbit in February of this year, and it has a TV camera, and it returned the first pictures of the far side of the moon. And regardless of the fact that we beat them to orbit, there's something about having actual photos of the far side which has really swayed public opinion overwhelmingly in favor of the American space program. So of course it has been demanded that we match this achievement, and to that end we are launching Luna 7. It looks like we're launching at night. It's actually just an extremely overcast day here at Baikonur. So once we actually rise above the cloud layer, you'll see we get a dramatic increase in brightness. For some reason, the ambient light boost doesn't affect you when you're in the shadow of clouds. So being on an overcast day is actually darker than night at the moment. I'm not entirely sure how to go about fixing that, but regardless, the R11 performs nominally and we launch Luna 7 on a trajectory towards the moon. Now, yeah, this is kind of showing off in a sense, because I wanted to make this clear. This is a leapfrog even over the American spacecraft. I believe it was Explorer 7 that is currently orbiting the moon. Not only is it significantly larger and it's going to go into a much lower orbit of the moon, but also it has a full suite of scientific instruments that Explorer 7 does not, including that all-important infrared radiometer and an orbital perturbation experiment, which takes 9 years to complete. And to that end, we have 4 massive solar panels to try and keep this thing powered for that entire duration. I doubt it will last that long, but my hope is that maybe it will. The sort of plan is that it will use 2 of those solar panels until they've degraded so much they can't power it anymore, and then it will turn around and use the other 2 solar panels for the remainder of its time. Since they won't be facing the sun, hopefully they won't degrade. That's the plan. It has the slightly comical effect of making the space probe look like it has big ears, like a kind of like an elephant, which I thought was amusing. We're getting a lot of use out of this RD0109 engine now, though. Look at that. It's I think twice as powerful as our 0109. Yeah, it's not to be confused with the 0109, which is the next engine above. Exactly the same name, just with a 0 before it, which is extremely confusing. But yeah, we do manage to complete our burn. And then, yeah, N9's run into this problem in the past. It's clearly a telemetry error, something wrong with the guidance of the spacecraft, but our encounter vanishes and we slightly overburned. So I use our RCS to, reduce our velocity a little bit, but we don't actually know what our encounter is going to be until we reach the moon, and it's less than ideal. So we're going to have to perform a burn on the far side of the moon to actually get into orbit, and this was a little concerning until I realized Luna 5 is actually going to be in exactly the right position to relay our communications. This is the benefit of having multiple lunar orbiters, so we don't have to worry about losing communications on the far side of the moon. We can relay our communications by Luna 7 and complete our orbital insertion, and that puts us into a perfect orbit to get all of the biome science from across the moon from that infrared radiometer, and the correct orbit to complete our orbital perturbation experiment, which gives us 300 science over the course of 9 years, so it's certainly worth doing. You'll see a lot of our satellites this episode actually look very, very similar. I sort of created a universal satellite bus that can control all of its own mass, so it has sufficient avionics to control, I believe, about 1 ton, and a lot of space for any potential communications, weather, or navigation satellite payload. So that means we don't have to keep tooling differently sized satellite buses. So I thought that was a good idea. This is obviously heavily modified since it was going all the way out to the moon, but you'll see later, most of our Earth orbit satellites are beginning to look very, very similar because it saves us a bunch of tooling costs. Regardless though, we've completed our tracking station upgrade and we've finished researching early power generation and storage, giving us access to a solar panel upgrade and hinged solar panels. So now we have everything we need to get working on an interplanetary probe, because we have a Mars transfer window in September of this year and we are planning to take full advantage of it. We're also researching early landing and some more staged combustion engines, because I'm thinking Probably not in 1962, but maybe 1963, we might try and land a probe on the moon. We're also researching high-speed flight, because I'm thinking next episode, 1961 was the year when the Soviet Union tested the Tsar bomb, and so I'm thinking maybe on a stream or something we'll design a bear and actually go do that atomic weapons test. Regardless, though, we do get a little bit of sad news shortly afterwards, as Raphael retires. I was actually planning for him to be the one to fly that bear, but well, we'll have to hire someone new at Plesetsk. But in more pressing news, on June 6th, the US launches an upgraded Merkury capsule, and intercepted telemetry indicates that it is capable of orbital maneuvering. In fact, its trajectory brings it uncomfortably close to Sputnik 2. Now, NASA publicly states that the mission is unmanned, but US fleet movements and recovery operations indicate that someone may well have been on board. Now, we have no way of knowing if they actually rendezvoused or tampered with Sputnik 2 since we lost contact with that satellite years ago, but the US potentially having this capability is extremely concerning. After all, we are launching a lot of spy satellites, so really we want to launch as many spy satellites as we can before the US actually finds a way to shoot them down. We can launch 5 of these Pogoda satellites, and so we're going to try and launch 3 of those this year, and then the final 2 next year, and then hopefully we'll be able to get all of the data back before the US is able to rendezvous with one, ascertain its purpose, and potentially even destroy it. Thankfully, the R8 is now a very reliable launch vehicle, so we reach orbit without any problems, and Pogoda 7 begins scanning the US. Clearly, we have quite a large gap in our knowledge of their capabilities, because we didn't believe that they had a powerful enough launch vehicle to actually put something capable of orbital maneuvering into orbit. So clearly we were very, very wrong about their true capabilities. Still though, in the meantime, we have been working on this Krasnyy 1, which is our first interplanetary probe, and this is going to head all the way out to Mars and perform a flyby. Now, we don't have a large enough launch vehicle to send an orbiter just yet. This is going to be barely able to do a flyby, but still it should return hopefully the first images of another planet. It is a 0.8 ton spacecraft, so it's pretty sizable. It has full 3-axis control, and so we should be able to get some pretty stunning images of Mars's surface, as well as, of course, infrared radiometry data and all of the usual scientific experiments. We're only launching very short-term experiments on it, though, obviously, because we're only going to fly past Mars maybe more than once, though. I'm hoping that after our encounter we'll have enough Delta V that we can actually get a second encounter at a later date, but we will have to see with regard to that, because we do have a little generic thruster with some storable nitrous oxide on it, so we can make course corrections, but it only has about 100 meters per second of Delta V, so not very much. The majority of the weight of the spacecraft, in fact, is actually just batteries, because yeah, that 1.25 meter parabolic antenna uses a lot of power when it's transmitting. I believe it's about 500 watts when it's transmitting, and of course our solar panels can only produce around 35 watts, so we need to have a lot of electric charge stored up ready for when we perform that flyby. I might even disable the data transmission, perform the flyby, do all of our scientific experiments, and then spend perhaps even the next year or so slowly transmitting that data back to the Earth. We shall have to see. Now, we're actually launching this 2 months ahead of the September launch window, and that's because I didn't know if something would go wrong on the launch. I wanted to have enough time to build another one just in case. Now, I did then decide to actually, you know, we are going to build another one anyway, simply because the kickstage engine, the 0109 engine, has a 10% ignition failure rate, and I don't really want to risk that not igniting and then the Americans potentially beating us to Mars. So, in the meantime, though, we're going to boost Svet 5 into its final orbit as it's running a little bit low on the old electric charge, and we hand it off to its customer, as well as building this Molniya 1. Yes, we're launching our first Molniya communication satellite, an actually useful communication satellite for the Soviet Union, as our geostationary ones, don't actually reach the majority of the Soviet Union. Now, we're doing this and, of course, boosting Svet 5 into its final orbit because we need a bit more money. Most of the missions we've been doing this year are just scientific missions. They don't actually have contracts behind them, or contracts that don't pay for quite a while with regard to our flyby contract. So we don't have enough money to actually begin building a second Mars probe. So we're launching these missions to get a bit more money so we can actually build that second Mars probe in time for the launch window, as we will actually have to rush build it a little bit. Unfortunately though, my fears about Krasnyy 1 actually come true on Molniya 1, as the second stage engine fails to ignite. So we're not actually going to have enough money to build a second Mars probe, so now we just have to cross our fingers and hope that the engine on Krasnyy 1 actually ignites. Still though, we get some very concerning news from the United States, as on the 16th of September they launch Markiner 1, which is publicly stated to be a Mars flyby mission. So it looks like we're going to be in a race to get to Mars. Unfortunately for us though, having launched the probe 2 months earlier, our orbit is completely misaligned. Yeah, my mission planning leaves a lot to be desired. I haven't done these kind of interplanetary missions in Realism Overhaul before, so yeah, we can barely get to Mars. There is only one burn that we can do which actually fits within our delta V requirements. And I thought I included a comfortable delta V margin, but that was assuming that we would actually have a properly aligned orbit and intercept Mars at our descending node. Unfortunately, we're going to have to go onto a very low energy trajectory and intercept Mars almost 200 days later. Yeah, this is going to take us 495 days to reach Mars. So if Markiner 1, that's a bit of a stunted way to put a K in Mariner, I gotta say, but if that is injected onto a somewhat normal trajectory to Mars, it looks like the Americans are going to beat us. Although, to be fair, we don't even have any idea if the launch even went successfully. So we'll have to see in the next episode and in the coming years whether or not we will be the first to return images of Mars. But unfortunately, it's not looking great. Still though, Krasnyy 1 is actually bigger, so you know, we got that to to boast about. As far as I'm aware, Markiner 1 is only 0.2 tons and Krasnyy 1 is 0.8 tons. So just saying, mine's bigger. So we win on style points, if nothing else. We have to perform fairly sizable correction burn. I wanted to do this just as we were leaving Earth, but our antenna is only S-band. To save weight and power, we don't have a UHF antenna, so we had to wait until we were in range of one of the large S-band ground stations. So yeah, it required most of our orbital maneuvering delta V to actually perform that correction burn, but we should pass within a hair's breadth of Mars's atmosphere and get a veritable bounty of biome science from Mars. But that will be arriving in 1962, so we've got a little ways to wait. Although this is actually our first solar probe, and I say solar probe with an asterisk, as we have had stuff head into interplanetary space before, but we haven't been able to communicate with it. But here we actually get quite a bit of scientific data just from the space around the sun. So using all of that science, we're going to do a little bit more researching stability and improved flight control. We're actually working our way towards the lunar orbiter capsules, because I do actually want to launch a Zond spacecraft on a translunar flyby with some crew on board. That won't be until like 1963-64. We'll need a Proton rocket to actually do that, but that's sort of our next big goal. Of course, we're going to be doing multi-crew missions and all sorts of things, but our next major milestone really is that crewed lunar flyby. In the meantime though, we're going to attempt to launch another Molniya satellite, and you can see the R12 has now been upgraded with that interstage because I think it looks awesome, and as I said, it's more realistic. That's the reason why Russian rockets have those hollow lattice interstages, is because they hot fire the engines and the exhaust plume needs to go somewhere. The Americans don't use them because they usually use separation motors to actually get ullage and settle the fuel at the bottom of the tanks. But hot firing our engines, although it's a little bit more tricky, I guess. It's a little bit more dangerous. It reduces the complexity and the mass of the launch vehicle. So that's what we are going to do. The reason why the first R12 at the beginning of the episode didn't have one of those is because I designed that one at the end of the previous episode. So we just launched that, and then all of our future R12s will now have the new design. But thankfully, this mission goes off without a hitch. So we get into orbit, and then we're ready to perform our final orbital insertion into a Molniya orbit, which is a highly eccentric 12-hour orbit, which spends most of its time over the higher latitudes of the Earth. So yeah, it's actually a useful satellite for communications in the Soviet Union. This satellite is using our universal satellite bus as well, and that actually contains the orbital perturbation experiment and the infrared radiometer experiment, because there's a fair bit of science, especially high above the Earth, that Svet 5 didn't get, and I'm just going to put the orbital perturbation experiment on like every probe that we launch over the next year, because it takes 9 years to complete that experiment, and there's data from low and high space above the Earth, so the more satellites we have researching that, the better. But thankfully we complete our contract and our first Molniya satellite begins operation. So yeah, I wasn't kidding about accelerating things at Placets. We put a few points into the VAB and we are churning out these spy satellites. Pogoda 8 is now launching in October. Yeah, I am genuinely concerned that the US might try and explode one of these. It's something that, of course, myself and A9 have been threatening to do for ages, shaking our fists at each other and threatening to destroy each other's satellites. Never before has there actually been a genuine possibility that he might actually do that. So it's something I am concerned about. So we're going to try and get all of these launched and completed before he's able to put any kind of mission like that together. I'm quite confident we should be able to get most of our Pogoda satellites launched before he's able to put that sort of thing together. I know he's still playing catch up with us, really, and that would be a relatively pointless mission other than stopping us from getting about 40 science. Around the same time, actually, Pogoda 6 finishes its mission. It's used all of its film, and we return it to the Earth. It seems I forgot to dial down the power of the decoupler, though, because the decoupler fires off this return capsule at such a velocity that instead of landing in the Soviet Union, it lands in the Antarctic. We still get our 40 science, but I imagine that was quite the expedition to go fetch that. Using that science, though, we're going to research early docking and 1961 orbital rocketry for the engine variants that provides us with. And now we are bringing ourselves to our final mission, or missions, I should say, of the year. Now, although the Americans seem to have demonstrated rendezvous capability earlier in the year, it wasn't publicized. So what we want to do is get the first public display of an orbital rendezvous, and to that end we are launching Vostok 4 and Vostok 5. We've rolled them out to separate launch pads, and we are going to launch them one day after the other and rendezvous them in orbit. And this is very, very similar to the real life Vostok 3 and 4. Although they didn't possess orbital maneuvering capability, they were launched onto trajectories that brought them within 6.5 kilometers of each other, which was close enough to actually see each other and communicate via radio, which is the first time that was ever done. But we're going to try and go one further. We're going to bring our spacecraft within 100 meters of each other and actually stop so they can actually see each other and, I don't know, hang out, have a little chat about how amazing the Soviet Union is. To achieve this, we've upgraded our Vostok capsule quite significantly. We've added a bunch of extra fuel, and we've also added a bunch of rendezvous lights and such to make their job a little bit easier. Of course, the engine on the Vostok actually has unlimited ignitions. It's a hypergolic engine. All they have to do is open the valves and let the fuel flow. So adding a bit of extra fuel doesn't actually cause us any problems. So what we have to do is get these into orbit, and then the rest should hopefully run like clockwork. You can see we're actually launching a new cosmonaut. After Raphael retired, I realized, yeah, we really need someone new. I want to be launching a new cosmonaut on every Vostok mission to try and spread the experience around, because it is A very, very exciting mission, and it levels them up to level 1 pilots. So this is Pavel Kerman. He has some rather glorious facial hair there. I'm not entirely sure how that's allowed in the Russian military, but whatever, you know, he looks beautiful. So yeah, I'm certainly not going to scold him for it. And you can see clearly there some extra batteries and some extra fuel tanks mounted to the side of the Vostok spacecraft to allow it to last for 3 days in orbit and perform quite a bit of orbital maneuvering. We actually had way more fuel than we ended up needing, but I wanted to make sure that we had every opportunity to make this work. But now Pavel is in orbit. All he has to do is wait for 24 hours because, of course, Baikonur is no longer aligned with his orbital plane, and then we will be launching Vladimir. Yes, the first Kerbal in space will be launched on the final Vostok mission, which I find to be particularly poetic, actually. He's going to fly on the final Vostok, complete this rendezvous, and then we're going to suspend Vostok flight until we've unlocked Voskod, which we'll be hopefully doing in 1961. Before then, though, Pavel does need to make some adjustments to his orbit. We want to be in a almost perfectly circular 250 kilometer orbit. And you can see here he finally lowers his apoapsis down to 250 kilometers just as he passes over Italy. And he does actually receive some rather strange radio broadcasts from the ground below. 24 hours later, Vladimir is launched from the 700-ton pad at Baikonur on Vostok 5. Yeah, we built a 700-ton pad because that's what we're going to need for the Proton rocket, which we might be able to build next episode, but more than likely will be built in 1963 since it's a few tech nodes away from us at the moment. Thankfully, though, the Feikel launch vehicle is extremely reliable at this point, so the launch goes off without a hitch. Yeah, Yuri risked his life proving this launch vehicle and making the Vostok spacecraft safe, but thankfully now it is a reliable way of getting cosmonauts up and into orbit. You will see, though, we are on the B variant of the Feikel, which has that RD-0107 engine rather than the 109 engine that we were using previously. And that just has a bit more thrust and allows us to get a bit more payload into orbit, and we needed that for the extra fuel tanks and batteries that we placed on 4 and 5. Now it is going to be Vladimir's responsibility to rendezvous with Pavel, since of course he is the veteran. He wants to be the one to do the active maneuvering and bring himself right in close to Vostok 4. Unfortunately, though, we were getting some weird phantom oscillations on Vostok 5, and I don't really know what exactly was causing these. I think it might have been the lights at the top, since they're sort of attached to the decoupler, not onto the actual descent module, so that they detach before we re-enter the atmosphere. But for whatever reason, we were burning through our nitrogen maneuvering fuel at an alarming rate. And if I turned off the smart ASS, the spacecraft started oscillating wildly. So all the time that we're holding attitude, we're burning through our nitrogen. And I didn't actually think to include any extra nitrogen in those auxiliary fuel tanks. We only have fuel for the main engine, and that was probably an oversight on my part, but I thought that 10,000 units of nitrogen would be more than enough, and it probably would have been if it weren't for these phantom oscillations. So it actually gets to a point where, yeah, we just don't have a comfortable enough RCS fuel margin for Vladimir to perform the final approach. So I swapped back over to Vostok 4, which for some reason doesn't have the same problem, and I actually performed just the final approach with Pavel, just because I really don't want to run out of RCS fuel on Vostok 5. If we run out of RCS fuel, they are dead. It's simple as that. If they can't orient the spacecraft to perform their retrograde burn, they can't re-enter the atmosphere, and they're going to die. So yeah, that's obviously not something that I want to risk having happen. But thankfully, we managed to rendezvous with Vostok 5 without any problems, and Pavel and Vladimir begin communicating enthusiastically over the radio. After slowing down to almost 0 meters per second relative velocity, they're able to orient their spacecraft so that they can even see each other through their windows and wave at each other excitedly. Unfortunately, only after about 15 minutes or so of being within 100 meters of each other, we get a warning that the nitrogen levels on Vladimir's spacecraft are getting dangerously low. So I really don't want to risk keeping Vostok 5 in orbit for any longer. So we're going to perform our deorbit burn, and we're going to bring Vladimir home first, which is a little unusual since he was actually launched second, so he hasn't been in orbit all that long. Of course, we wanted to give the first Kerbal in space a little longer to enjoy being in orbit and being weightless, and appreciate the view for the time that he can. But unfortunately, yeah, we just can't afford to risk him not being able to re-enter the atmosphere. So the decision is made to bring him home early and then bring Pavel home second, as Pavel's spacecraft is performing perfectly. So I'm not entirely sure what is causing all the problems with Vladimir's. You can see there we managed to witness the service module burning up, and Vladimir begins a rather gentle re-entry back to the Soviet Union. Now, this is a more gentle re-entry trajectory than Vostok's 2 or 3 went on. They both had periapsis of around 45 kilometers, and this has a periapsis of around 65. Unfortunately, though, despite the heat meter indicating otherwise, this is still too aggressive for the capsule, and the Vostok spacecraft disintegrates. A post-flight investigation would later reveal that, due to a manufacturing defect, during the oscillations at launch, a small rupture formed in one of the auxiliary fuel tanks, creating the phantom oscillations, and upon separating from the service module, it caused the descent module to actually bump back into it, creating a crack in the heat shield, which unfortunately doomed Vladimir to have his spacecraft disintegrate around him during re-entry. This is a pretty tragic end to the most famous cosmonaut in the Soviet Union, the first Kerbal in space. And while I thought it would be a nice poetic end for his career, since he's getting near retirement, unfortunately has a tragic twist. And it turns out what actually happened is, during our update to 1.10.1, either Deadly Reentry has got even more aggressive, or the RO Capsules mod has reduced the heat tolerance of the Vostok spacecraft. Because as I said, Vostoks 2 and 3 had significantly harsher re-entries and were absolutely fine. But for whatever reason, Vostok 5 exceeded the heat tolerance of the spacecraft and disintegrated. So we have an extremely gentle re-entry with Pavel, and even that brings the spacecraft close to its heat tolerance. So it's clearly a lot more fragile than it used to be. I mean, it's my fault. I really should have simulated the mission. I didn't have any inkling that the heat tolerance might have changed. I just did the mission according to the lessons that we previously learned from doing Vostok missions. So unfortunately, whoever re-entered first was doomed to disintegrate, it seems, which is pretty sobering, in fact. This actually genuinely upset me a little bit. I thought this would be a triumph for the Soviet Union. And of course, the ground control teams haven't informed Pavel yet of the fate of Vostok 5, because they want him to perform the rest of his mission with a clear head. But upon safely landing in Kazakhstan, the recovery crews reach him and give him the news. We can't cover this up. Vladimir is a public figure, and this whole mission has been widely publicized in order to demonstrate the superiority of Soviet technology over the Americans. So there's no hiding from this. Unfortunately, Vladimir is gone. Obviously not the triumphant end to 1960 that we'd hoped for, but we still managed to complete our orbital flight and our orbital rendezvous contracts, and as such we can now accept the crewed lunar flyby contract, which has a deadline of 1966, which I'm very confident we'll be able to achieve, and a ridiculous advanced payment of 3.5 million funds. So we're using that to upgrade our R&D center, which we're going to need if we want to research the Proton launch vehicle and the crewed lunar flyby capsules that we need, as well as the mission control center and a lot of VAB upgrades. Yeah, we're trying to get the second production line at Baikonur at least close to the production capability of the first line, as well as investing in our R&D center and the production line at Plesetsk. We've actually constructed a 150-ton pad at Plesetsk this year, which we're going to start using next year to launch R12 Cosmos launch vehicles and begin constructing a few more communications constellations that hopefully this time don't die after 2 months. But that is the end of the episode. We've got a lot of exciting things ready for next episode, of course. We're not going to fly Vostok again, especially after what just happened. We're going to be flying Vostok, hopefully performing the first EVA, which is extremely exciting, and of course our spacecraft will be arriving at Mars. So lots of exciting things to look forward to, although the next episode will be around the 12th of September because I know N9 is going on holiday. So in the meantime, I might do that stream that I mentioned, designing the bear and dropping the SAR bomb, which I think could be a lot of fun. I also might use the breathing room to finish Beyond Kerbal. I know a lot of people have been asking, and a lot of people are really excited to see how that series ends. I know exactly how I'm going to end it. I just need to find the time to do that. So I might hopefully be able to do that before September. We shall have to see. Thank you for watching, everyone. I do hope you have enjoyed, and I will see you all next time. A massive thank you to my patrons and donators for their generous support, and an extra special thank you to Madzor, Peter Lushtinets, The Amazing Steak, Vermouth, Lady Lagsalot, Dennis Klomp, Axel Jensen, Delta V, Extra Crispy, Victor Eriksson, Simone67, Wather, Jagnath, Nicholas Popkis, World, Lightning Gamer, Olaf Hammerhand, Elmac, and Nobody Special.